Chapter 12 of Some Problems of Philosophy, a Beginning of an Introduction to Philosophy, by William James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Novelty and Causation, the Conceptual View. If reality changes by finite sensible steps, the question whether the bits of it that come are radically new remains unsettled still. Remember our situation at the end of chapter 3. Being überhaupt, or at large, we there found to be undeducible. For our intellect it remains a casual and contingent quantum that is simply found or begged. May it be begged bit by bit as it adds itself? Or must we beg it only once, by assuming it either to be eternal, or to have come in an instant that co-implicated all the rest of time? Did or did not the first morning of creation write what the last dawn of reckoning shall read? With these questions monism and pluralism stand face to face again. The classic obstacle to pluralism has always been what is known as the principle of causality. This principle has been taken to mean that the effect in some way already exists in the cause. If this be so, the effect cannot be absolutely novel, and in no radical sense can pluralism be true. We must therefore review the facts of causation. I take them in conceptual translation before considering them in perceptual form. The first definite inquiry into cause was made by Aristotle. The why of anything, he said, is furnished by four principles: the material cause of it, as when bronze makes a statue; the formal cause, as when the ratio of 2 to 1 makes an octave; the efficient cause, as when a father makes a child; and the final cause, as when one exercises for the sake of health. Christian philosophy adopted the four causes, but what one generally means by the cause of anything is its efficient cause, and in what immediately follows I shall speak of that alone. An efficient cause is scholastically defined as that which produces something else by a real activity proceeding from itself. This is unquestionably the view of common sense, and scholasticism is only common sense grown quite articulate. Passing over the many classes of efficient cause which scholastic philosophy specifies, I will enumerate three important sub-principles it is supposed to follow from the above definition. Thus, 1. No effect can come into being without a cause. This may be verbally taken, but if, avoiding the word effect, it be taken in the sense that nothing can happen without a cause, it is the famous principle of causation, which, when combined with the next two principles, is supposed to establish the block universe, and to render the pluralistic hypothesis absurd. 2. The effect is always proportionate to the cause, and the cause to the effect. 3. Whatever is in the effect must in some way, whether formally, virtually, or immanently, have been also in the cause. Formally here means that the cause resembles the effect, as when one motion causes another motion. Virtually means that the cause somehow involves that effect, without resembling it, as when an artist causes a statue, but possesses not himself its beauty. Immanently means that the cause, though unlike the effect, is superior to it in perfection, as when a man overcomes a lion's strength by greater cunning. Nemo dat quod non habet is the real principle from which the causal philosophy flows, and the proposition causa aequat effectum practically sums up the whole of it. Footnote: read for a concise statement of the school doctrines of causation the account of J. Rickaby, General Metaphysics, Book 2, Chapter 3. I omit from my text various subordinate maxims, which have played a great part in causal philosophy, as the cause of a cause is the cause of its effects; the same causes produce the same effects; causes act only when present; a cause must exist before it can act, etc. End footnote. It is plain that each moment of the universe must contain all the causes of which the next moment contains effects. Or, to put it with extreme concision, it is plain that each moment in its totality causes the next moment. Footnote: This notion follows also from the consideration of conditioning circumstances being at bottom as indispensable as causes for producing effects. The cause, philosophically speaking, is the sum total of the conditions positive and negative, says J. S. Mill. This is equivalent to the entire state of the universe at the moment that precedes the effect. But neither is the effect in that case the one fragmentary event which our attention first abstracted under that name. It is that fragment, along with all its concomitants, or in other words, it is the entire state of the universe at the second moment desired. But if the maxim holds firm, that quidquid est in effectu debet, esse prius aliquo modo in causa, it follows that the next moment can contain nothing genuinely original, and that the novelty that appears to leak into our lives so unremittingly must be an illusion, ascribable to the shallowness of the perceptual point of view. Scholasticism always respected common sense, and in this case escaped the frank denial of all genuine novelty by the vague qualification aliquo modo. This allowed the effect also to differ aliquo modo from its cause. But conceptual necessities have ruled the situation and have ended, as usual, by driving nature and perception to the wall. A cause and its effect are two numerically discrete concepts, and yet in some inscrutable way the former must produce the latter. How can it intelligibly do so, save by already hiding the latter in itself? Numerically, too, cause and effect must be generically one, in spite of the perceptual appearances, and causation changes thus from a concretely experienced relation between differents into one between similars abstractly thought of as more real. Sir William Hamilton expresses this very compactly. What is the law of causality? Simply put, that when an object is presented phenomenally as commencing, we cannot but suppose that the complement, i.e., the amount of existence which it now contains has previously been. In other words, that all that we at present know as an effect must previously have existed in its causes, though what these causes are we may perhaps be altogether unable to surmise. End of Lecture 39 of the Metaphysics. The cause becomes a reason, the effect a consequence, and since logical consequence follows only from the same to the same, the older, vaguer causation philosophy develops into the sharp, rationalistic dogma that cause and effect are two names for one persistent being, and that, if the successive moments of the universe be causally connected, no genuine novelty leaks in. The overthrow of perception by conception took a long time to complete itself in this field. The first step was the theory of occasionalism, to which Descartes led the way by his doctrine that mental and physical substance, the one consisting purely of thought, the other purely of extension, were absolutely dissimilar. If this were so, any such causal intercourse as we instinctively perceive between mind and body ceased to be rational. For thinkers of that age, God was the great solvent of absurdities. He could get over every contradiction. Consequently, Descartes' disciples, Regis and Cordemoy, and especially Goulinex, denied the fact of psychological interaction altogether. God, according to them, immediately caused the changes in our mind of which events in our body, and those in our body of which events in our mind, appear to be the causes, but of which they are in reality only the signals or occasions. Leibniz took the next step forward, in quenching the claim to truth of our perceptions. He freed God from the duty of lending all his hourly assistance, by supposing him to have decreed on the day of creation that the changes in our several minds should coincide with those in our several bodies, after the manner in which clocks, wound up on the same day, thereafter keep time with one another. With this pre-established harmony, so called, the conceptual translation of the immediate given, with its never failing result of negating both activity and continuity, is complete. Instead of the dramatic flux of personal life, a bare one-to-one correspondence between the terms of two causally unconnected series is set up. God is the sole cause of anything, and the cause of everything at once. The theory is as monistic as the rationalist heart can desire, and of course novelty would be impossible if it were true. David Hume made the next step in discrediting common sense causation. In the chapters on the idea of necessary connection, both in his treatise on human nature and in his essays, he sought for a positive picture of the efficacy of power which causes are assumed to exert, and failed to find it. He shows that neither in the physical nor in the mental world can we abstract or isolate the energy transmitted from causes to effects. This is as true of perception as it is of imagination. All ideas are derived from and represent impressions. We never have any impression that contains any power or efficacy. We never, therefore, have any idea of power. We never can by our utmost scrutiny discover anything but one event following another, without being able to comprehend any force or power by which the cause operates, or any connection between it and its supposed effect. The necessary conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of connection or power at all, and that these words are absolutely without any meaning when employed either in philosophical reasoning or in common life. Nothing is more evident than that the mind cannot form such an idea of two objects as to conceive any connection between them, or comprehend distinctly that power or efficacy by which they are united. The pseudo idea of a connection which we have, Hume then goes on to show, is nothing but the misinterpretation of a mental custom. When we have often experienced the same sequence of events, we are carried by habit, upon the appearance of the first one, to expect its usual attendant, and to believe that it will exist. This customary transition of the imagination is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. Nothing farther is in the case. A cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the idea of the other. Nothing could be more essentially pluralistic than the elements of Hume's philosophy. He makes events rattle against their neighbors as dryly as if they were dice in a box. He might with perfect consistency have believed in real novelties and upheld free will. But I said a while ago that most empiricists have been half-hearted, and Hume was perhaps the most half-hearted of the lot. In his essay on Liberty and Necessity, he insists that the sequences which we experience, though between events absolutely disconnected, are yet absolutely uniform, and that nothing genuinely new can flower out of our lives. The reader will recognize in Hume's famous pages a fresh example of the way in which conceptual translations always maltreat fact. Perceptually or concretely, as we shall notice in more detail later, causation names the manner in which some fields of consciousness introduce other fields. It is but one of the forms in which experience appears as a continuous flow. Our names show how successfully we can discriminate within the flow. But the conceptualist rule is to suppose that where there is a separate name, there ought to be a fact as separate. And Hume, following this rule, and finding no such fact corresponding to the word power, concludes that the word is meaningless. By this rule every conjunction and proposition in human speech is meaningless. In, on, of, with, but, and, if are as meaningless as for and because. The truth is that neither the elements of fact nor the meanings of our words are separable as the words are. The original form in which fact comes is the perceptual Durcheinander, holding terms as well as relations in solution, or interfused and cemented. Our reflective mind abstracts diverse aspects in the muchness, as a man by looking through a tube may limit his attention to one part after another of a landscape. But abstraction is not insulation, and it no more breaks reality than the tube breaks the landscape. Concepts are notes, views taken on reality, not pieces of it, as bricks are of a house. Causal activity, in short, may play its part in growing fact, even though no substantive impression of it should stand out by itself. Hume's assumption that any factor of reality must be separable leads to his preposterous view that no relation can be real. All events, he writes, seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. Nothing, in short, belongs with anything else. Thus does the intellectualist method pulverize perception and triumph over life. Kant and his successors all espoused Hume's opinion that the immediately given is a disconnected manifold. But, unwilling simply to accept the manifold as Hume did, they invoked a superior agent, in the shape of what Kant called the transcendental ego of apperception, to patch its bits together by synthetic categories. Among these categories Kant inscribes that of causality, and in many quarters he passes for a repairer of the havoc that Hume made. His chapter on cause is the most confusedly written part of his famous critique, and its meaning is often hard to catch. As I understand his text, he leaves things just where Hume did, save that where Hume says habit, he says rule. They both cancel the notion that phenomena called causal ever exert power, or that a single case would ever have suggested cause and effect. In other words, Kant contradicts common sense as much as Hume does, and, like Hume, translates causation into mere time succession. Only, whereas the order in time was essentially loose for Hume, and only subjectively uniform, Kant calls it uniformity objective as obtaining in conformity to a law, which our Sinnlichkeit receives from our Verstand. Non-causal sequences can be reversed. Causal ones follow in conformity to rule. Footnote: Kant's whole notion of a rule is inconstruable by me. What or whom does the rule bind? If it binds the phenomenon that follows, the effect, we fall back into the popular dynamic view, and any single case would exhibit causal action, even were there no other cases in the world. Or does it bind the observer of the single case? But his own sensations of sequences are what bind him. Be a sequence causal or non-causal, if it is sensible, he cannot turn it backwards as he can his ideas. Or does the rule bind future sequences and determine them to follow in the same order which the first sequence observed? Since it obviously does not do this when the observer judges wrongly that the first sequence is causal, all we can say is that it is a rule whereby his expectations of uniformity follow his causal judgments, be these latter true or false. But wherein should this differ from the Humean position? Kant, in short, flounders, and in no truthful sense can one keep repeating that he has refuted Hume. End footnote. The word Verstand in Kant's account must not be taken as if the rule it is supposed to set to sensation made us understand things any better. It is a brute rule of sequence which reveals no tie. The non-rationality of such a category leaves it worthless for purposes of insight. It removes dynamic causation and substitutes no other explanation for the sequences found. It yields external descriptions only, and assimilates all cases to those where we discover no reason for the law ascertained. Our laws of nature do indeed in large part enumerate bare coexistences and successions. Yellowness and malleability coexist in gold. Redness succeeds on boiling in lobsters, coagulation in eggs. And to him who asks for the why of these uniformities, science only replies, not yet. Meanwhile, the laws are potent for prediction, and many writers on science tell us that this is all we can demand. To explain, according to the way of thinking called positivistic, is only to substitute wider or more familiar for narrower or less familiar laws. And the laws at their widest only express uniformities empirically found. Why does the pump suck up water? Because the air keeps pressing it into the tube. Why does the air press in? Because the earth attracts it. Why does the earth attract it? Because it attracts everything, such attraction being in the end only a more universal sort of fact. Laws according to their view only generalize facts, they do not connect them in any intimate sense. Against this purely inductive way of treating causal sequences, A more deductive interpretation has recently been urged. If the later member of a succession could be deduced by logic from the earlier member in the particular sequence, the tie would be unmistakable. But logical ties carry us only from sames to sames. So this last phase of scientific method is at bottom only the scholastic principle of causa aequat effectum brought into sharper focus and illustrated more concretely. It is thoroughly monistic in its aims, and if it could be worked out in detail, it would turn the real world into the procession of an eternal identity, with the appearances, of which we are perceptually conscious, occurring as a sort of byproduct to which no scientific importance could be attached. Footnote: Consciousness, writes M. Cotoret, to cite a handy expression of this mode of thought, is properly speaking the realm of the unreal. What remains in our subjective consciousness, after all objective facts have been projected and located in space and time, is the rubbish and residuum of the construction of the universe, the formless mass of images that were unable to enter into the system of nature and put on the garment of reality. End footnote. In any case, no real growth and no real novelty could effect an entrance into life. Footnote: I avoid amplifying this conception of cause and effect. An immense number of causal facts can indeed be explained satisfactorily by assuming that the effect is only a later position of the cause, and for the remainder we can fall back on the aliquo modo which gave such comfort in the past. Such an interpretation of nature would, of course, relegate variety, activity, and novelty to the limbo of illusions, as fast as it succeeded in making its static concepts cancel living facts. It is hard to be sincere, however, in following the conceptual method ruthlessly. And of the writers who think that in science causality must mean identity, some willingly allow that all such scientific explanation is more or less artificial, that identical molecules and atoms are like identical pounds and yards, only pegs in a conceptual arrangement for hanging percepts on in one-to-one relations, so as to predict facts in elegant or expeditious ways. This is the view of the conceptual universe which our own discussion has insisted on, and taking scientific logic in this way, no harm is done. Almost no one is radical in using scientific logic metaphysically. End footnote. This negation of real novelty seems to be the upshot of the conceptualist philosophy of causation. This is why I called it on page 189 the classic obstacle to the acceptance of pluralism's additive world. The principle of causality begins as a hybrid between common sense and intellectualism. What actively produces an effect, it says, must, in some way, contain the power of it already. But as nothing corresponding to the concept of power can be insulated, the activity feature of the sequence ere long gets suppressed, and the vague latency, supposed to exist aliquo modo in the causal phenomenon of the effect about to be produced, is developed into a static relation of identity between two concepts which the mind substitutes for the percepts between which the causal tie originally was found. Footnote: I omit saying anything in my text about energetics. Popular writers often appear to think that science has demonstrated a monistic principle called energy, which they connect with activity on the one hand and with quantity on the other. So far as I understand this difficult subject, energy is not a principle at all, still less an active one. It is only a collective name for certain amounts of immediate perceptual reality, when such reality is measured in definite ways that allow its changes to be written so as to get constant sums. It is not an ontological theory at all, but a magnificent economic schematic device for keeping account of the functional variations of the surface phenomena. It is evidently a case of non fingo hypothesis, and since it tolerates perceptual reality, it ought to be regarded as neutral in our causal debate. End footnote. The resultant state of enlightened opinion about cause is, as I have called it before, confused and unsatisfactory. Few philosophers hold radically to the identity view. The view of the logicians of science is easier to believe, but not easier to believe metaphysically, for it violates instinct almost as strongly. Mathematicians make use, to connect the various interdependencies of quantities, of the general concept of function. That A is a function of B, A equals B, means that with every alteration in the value of A, an alteration in that of B is always connected. If we generalize so as to include qualitative dependencies, we can conceive the universe as consisting of nothing but elements with functional relations between them. And science has then for its sole task the listing of the elements and the describing in the simplest possible terms the functional relations. Changes, in short, occur, and ring throughout phenomena, but neither reasons nor activities, in the sense of agencies, have any place in this world of scientific logic, which, compared with the world of common sense, is so abstract as to be quite spectral, and merits the appellation so often quoted from Mr. Bradley of an unearthly ballet of bloodless categories. End of chapter 12.